Welcome back to another episode of EpicEarth. EpicEarth is a podcast for those curious about the STEM fields and the awesome, quirky, and fun experiences and research taking place right now. If you enjoy listening to stories like these, hit that like, follow, and subscribe button. This is episode number 26, The Many Facets of Volcanic Eruptions, the True Beauty and the Beast. So sit back, relax, and enjoy another ride as we take you on a journey around this epic Earth.
I found it all so fascinating, just learning all the information.
Nobody told me I couldn't do it, and I loved it.
And now I know how to learn. Like, this is a doable thing.
You know, that's an impact that we can't ignore.
All right, welcome back to another episode of EpicEarth. I'm Ashley Bosa, your host, and with me is my co-host, Brian Rosenblatt.
Hey, everyone. Happy to be here.
Hey, Brian. We're sort of going back to Zoom land this week. We have a very special guest with us all the way from the UK, which is exciting, on a totally different time zone right now, halfway across the world. So I'd like to introduce her now. Sharon Backhouse is the Director of GeoTenerife, which is a UK and Spanish company that organizes field trips and training programs in the sunny Canary Islands. They've produced a documentary on the eruption of La Palma. That volcanic eruption occurred in 2021, and we're going to hear a little bit about that production and that movie and that eruption. And that movie is called Lava Bombs. If you haven't seen it, you should get a hold of it because it's a fantastic production. And it's available on Amazon and iTunes. GeoTenerife also openly publishes their ongoing research into the impacts of the eruption in La Palma through something called Volcano Stories, which is on their website, which Sharon is also going to talk about. I think we're just going to dive straight in because Sharon has a lot of interesting stuff to tell us. So welcome, Sharon.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Brian. Such a pleasure to join you. Nice to see you from a very rainy UK. So hi.
Oh, I bet it never rains in the UK. So that must be a rare weather event.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for joining us, Sharon. It's such a pleasure to have you on our podcast, especially for all of our listeners and hopefully our future listeners. I think you have some amazing stories to tell us. So we're going to start by telling us a little bit about yourself. What makes you you, Sharon?
And now, what makes you you?
Oh my goodness. So I had a very different incarnation before starting GeoTenerife. I was actually a journalist for many years. And then I moved back to the Canary Islands. And the key thing about me is that I have a journalistic viewpoint on things, which might sort of explain some of the stuff we're going to talk about later, and a huge love for the Canary Islands, and a love of education and spreading the word about things. So I guess that's me, a lover of the Canary Islands, education, but with a journalistic eye.
Oh, brilliant. Did you grow up around journalists, or how did you get into journalism?
I actually went into journalism because I loved writing about things. I have a love of the written word. I have a love of communication. And I started very early, actually, when I was in college. The first magazine I edited was on the college printers back in the day, where you kind of had to crank it round by hand practically, in aid of Great Ormond Street Hospital for kids here in the UK. So from the very early days, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And it was a fantastic career I did for 20 years that took me to some amazing places, to meet incredible people. But now I'm in a completely new phase with GeoTenerife. So that's exciting too.
That's awesome. And what made you interested in GeoTenerife? What was it that got you into that sort of field of work?
Yeah. So about 10 years ago, when I moved back to the Canary Islands, my partner, Ignacio Garcia, who is from Tenerife, he worked at the Renewable Energy Institute. And we were just having a conversation one day, and he said, you know, Sharon, it's extraordinary The Canary Islands are the most fantastic destination for science. They're like island classrooms. You have a greater geological diversity than Hawaii, endemic flora, because these are basically natural hotspots for biodiversity. He said, but you get so few universities coming here every year, and those that do come just do the same 2 or 3 things every year. It's incredible. And that just got me to thinking, right? Because I was, at a moment in my life where I wanted to change and do something different. So we thought, well, perhaps we can do something better. And we started off really humbly 10 years ago. I think in our first year, we only organized 3 field trips, and that filled our whole year. It was hard work to get it off the ground. But the whole thing was that we wanted everybody who came to the island, A, to develop a love for the islands, because then they'd become advocates for the island, and B, to work with local people, because there's some amazing scientists and institutions doing incredible work on the islands. And it was a way for them also to widen their network and start working with other institutions, other scientists. And it just creates this really rich dynamic. And that's what we wanted to be right at the center of. And I have to say, 10 years on, we've never been busier. It's been crazy.
That's great. It's awesome to hear that the program is developing, and what a cool immersive field project to do. Like, man, I wish I could go to the Canary Islands and do field work there.
Guys, you're welcome here anytime. We do lots of different field trips and training programs. And the idea, again, is to do something different. We're not a university. And my journalistic background means that my real desire is to make sure that all young scientists who come through our programs are trained in science communication. And I think that's something we really saw, for example, during the recent eruption in La Palma, which we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure. But the importance of knowing how to talk about science in ways that people on everyday people who don't speak your lingo understand you. Because in terms of emergency, it's important, but also in terms of your future developments. If you're seeking funding from institutions or you need backing from people who aren't scientists, being able to talk passionately and interestingly about your science in a way that people give you their support is really important. We don't just want scientists to squirrel away in conferences and talk some foreign language. We actually want to be excited about your research. We want to know what you're doing. We want to understand it, why it's important to us, why it relates to us, and how we can, perhaps be involved in it. So science communication for me is absolutely the key of everything. And that is my journalistic background there coming to the fore, I think.
I love that. I think, that's part of the reason why Brian and I started the podcast, is because we figured, it's an informal platform for students and researchers alike to come and talk about their research in a way which is not so scientific, but it's fun. And it's like, hey, science can be like, really interesting to all sorts of backgrounds and diversity and ethnic groups. So that's
and science is cool. I mean, This is the thing. Once you strip away the words we don't understand, the stuff you guys look at are game changers. They're interesting. It's about processes that affect us in ways we hadn't even begun to think about, and we want to know about that as non-scientists, as long as we understand it. So I love what you're doing with the podcast. That's why I'm very, very happy to spend time with you and having this great chat with you. And
Thank you. Well, I would say even as a scientist, I like non-sciencey things when people explain it to me, because obviously we don't know about everything, right? Brian and I study a very niche type of topic in our respective fields. And so it's great to have other people come in and explain their research to us as well. We love hearing about it, because I learn something every time I have an interview. It's amazing.
Great.
So I guess we'll get a little bit more into GeoTenerife. So you've kind of already gone over the purpose and goals of the program. Who can apply for this program? What type of students can apply for it?
So we have a range of programs which are starting to sort of build up as we work with more and more institutions. It's open to undergraduates, recent postgraduates. We have a summer training program for a month, and this summer we're running 4 different streams. One of them in La Palma, one in Tenerife, which is trying to decode the explosive record from all these deposits from explosive eruptions. But we're looking at 2 new areas this year as well. and one of them is going to be sustainable tourism, which is a really important subject, which just isn't getting the platform it deserves at the moment, because these are islands which have a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of space, and we can't just keep cementing them over with more and more and more five-star hotels. I mean, there's more five-star hotels on the southern strip of Tenerife than there are in Madrid or Barcelona. The roads practically at a standstill several times a day. We don't have enough water. Energy is an issue. So all of these things we're going to start looking at this summer. And the other research project we're really focused on is volcanic preparedness. We live in volcanic islands, and we have to make sure we build resilience in those islands. So we're going to be looking at the lessons we learned in La Palma, but also what do we know about possible future events, and what do people need to be thinking about? Because I have a lot of friends who live in the Canary Islands, and they saw a volcanic eruption a year and a half ago, a couple of years ago, on a neighboring island, and they haven't sort of stopped to think, well, actually, my island's volcanic too. What should I be thinking about? And that's really important, really important.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing what our mind does, right? People that live in a very volcanic area. I mean, you can imagine that for US citizens who live around like the Cascade volcanoes, for example, which do not erupt that often. They're active, but they don't erupt. Their idea of volcanic hazards is in some ways maybe more limited than other people. Like I work around Volcan de Fuego in Guatemala, which erupts all the time. And communities that live around there, they are used to that volcano erupting. They understand the hazards a little bit more than people maybe living in the Cascades around the US. But
there's a couple of other issues which are important in the Canary Islands as well. On the one hand, any historic eruptions that have been are perhaps, belong to our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, and the stories have become kind of softened. So the last eruption in La Palma was 1971, and it was seen as the friendly volcano. It was actually a tourist attraction. It erupted right next to the coast. It was almost seemed like a free fireworks show. And so you had a lot of people talking in those sort of terms, which sort of maybe lulled some of the population into a bit of a false sense of security. And one of our students, Rosie Rice, who's now doing her master's and will follow up with her PhD at Cambridge University here in the UK, is looking at that relationship between memory and the eruption. How does that affect our response to an eruption and attachment to place? And the other thing is, of course, the tourist destinations, right? Yeah. So when we started GeoTenerife 10 years ago, our first meeting was with the government of the island, and we said, what are you doing to prepare people and to talk about these subjects? And said, we don't talk about that. We don't want to scare away the tourists. The whole island economy depends on that. And we're saying, well, first of all, there are people who will come here because they're volcanic. There is an interest in that. But also, we all have a responsibility to make sure people are informed and we build resilience. So that's not something we can just sort of shy away from and hope it'll disappear. And I think that's the responsibility of anybody working there in this sphere. So again, that's why we're going to be picking that up this summer.
Definitely. And it seems like that social aspect, that social science to understanding like resilience and things of remembering past eruptions and things like that is really it's an up and coming field. I know a lot of people, traditionally, a lot of people have focused on just the rigorous science, the hard sciences. We have to understand all the processes. But now I see a shift where they're
important too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But I see a shift where we're also starting to incorporate that social aspect into it, which is also really essential part to understanding these types of processes.
Absolutely. It's crucial. And I'll tell you, in La Palma, at any one time, in terms of the emergency response, they had 1,000 people on the ground for an island of 90,000 people. So that's actually, a pretty hefty response. But to my knowledge, not one of those was a social scientist. Now, the problem with that is that you can be doing your job very well within your little bubble, and it's important that you do that. But there was nobody there specifically sitting down and thinking, how are the people feeling right now? What can we do to support them? What messages do we need to bring out that can, accommodate what it is they're going through now? How can we message about what might happen tomorrow or the next day, not just stand there and give them results of what happened yesterday, which is something that is important too, but it's not the full story. You know, people need to make some really big decisions in the middle of an emergency. Should they leave the area? Are they going to leave the island? Can they move back? Do they have to keep safe? Do they have to wear masks for the ash? You know, all these things. So one of the things we're really calling for in terms of preparedness is to take all of this social science into consideration. And the other thing we saw is that volcanology is a really young science, and it needs to be a multidisciplinary science. And that's where it gets really exciting, because we saw a lot of use of drones, for example, in a way that they hadn't been used before in this type of event. Because this, of course, was an urban eruption, so it affected lots of people. It's not the same as an eruption somewhere, you know, in Iceland, where it doesn't affect any population. So I think it's a really exciting time for volcanology, but I think we have to really drive forward the lessons that we've been learning, because if we can help people better, you know, then that's a really important target for us. Because if you think nobody directly died as a cause of the lava flow, there was somebody who did die because of gases, that's fantastic. But a lot of stress to this day is felt by the population because of the poor messaging they get around a lot of subjects. And again, that comes back to my journalistic background. We have to message about all of this better and accompany the people better. We need people on the inside thinking about this, putting this together, and making sure we alleviate as much of the stress on people as possible.
Yeah, I love that. You're speaking my love language right now. That's like, basically my dream job is to do that outreach component for volcano preparedness. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, outreach isn't just at the time of an emergency either. So we then have to make the most of the time between eruptions to educate in schools, to go out into the community, and to make sure people are, you know, really well informed and prepared at every stage. And then we can minimize some of those really dramatic impacts people have been feeling out in La Palma.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we're going to come back to La Palma in a little bit, because I want to ask you about that production that you did. But first I want to ask you, what is the best or the most fun thing that you do?
I'm living my best life, Ashley. It's extraordinary. You know, I'm 53 now, and if I had to make up the dream job that I wanted to do, this would be it. So I just feel incredibly privileged, incredibly thankful, but also a little bit tired. It has been hard work getting here, but it's been worth every step of the way. And that's what I would say to anybody looking towards what they want to do towards the future. Think about where you want to be, where you're headed, and just take those little steps in that direction and be very focused and determined, work hard, and you'll get there. For me, it's all about the excitement of the discovery. You know, they discover new things in the Canary Islands the whole time. The fact that we spend our time out in the field with young students who are always at that stage in their career where they're just about to step into something new. We've built a whole family now of hundreds of students around the world who have all been with us for a month in the Canary Islands early on in their career. And that builds a really beautiful family, which then is very supportive amongst each other as well. And it's just fantastic. So for me, it's the people and the amazing landscape of the Canaries, which just makes my heart sing.
Yeah, that is amazing. I'm actually kind of sad to hear that some schools are getting rid of the field camp component. You know, like students are not undertaking that component to the geoscience majors as much anymore. Yeah. And I feel like it's essential because it builds that camaraderie. It sucks while you're in the field sometimes, you know, it depends on what field camp you go to. But I mean, you're so right in that you build this relationship with people, and it actually brings that, you know, volcanology or whatever field that you're in, it brings that community closer together, because then you have, you know, that experience of going through something that was really hard at the time, but you all were learning and you all were like building this knowledge base together, and you build those friendships and you network that way. So
and you know, they've built lifelong friendships being out in the field. And you know, I get it, there's an aspect to field work that you might think is unsustainable because you have to get on a plane and get there, but our field trips we put back locally, and that's what I think is so important. So I get frustrated when I see universities come in and their teachers teaching, but they don't live in that landscape. They don't live and breathe and teach that landscape. They don't research it. They're just teaching primarily from a book. And I think they're shortchanging their students. So with our field trips, we've restored a beautiful old Canary house, which was the oldest in the south of the island, which was an absolute Canarian architectural jewel, which was falling to the ground. So now that's our field trip centre. We work with lots of local experts. We work with lots of local companies and institutions, as I say, and that's just the way we build sustainability, by supporting everything that we can there. And look, I'm a linguist. I went to university and I studied Spanish and French, and if I hadn't gone to Paris for a year, I don't think I would have learned French in quite the same way from a book. You have to be there, you have to drink the coffee, smoke some very dodgy French cigarettes, and then you get into it. That's when you sort of start to really build the whole sensitivity to the culture and the language. And it's the same with this. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that field camps were getting cut from programs or whatnot. But coming from the discipline of like physics, where you never go out in the field with your peers, and then moving to geosciences, like that was one of the biggest differences that felt like it brought everyone together. It feels like that's what was missing in physics that is not missing in geosciences. So that's surprising that they're cutting that out. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's not as it used to be, at least when I was doing my undergrad, that you were required to do a field component at the end of your program or sometime during your program. And this is usually 4 to 6 weeks of intensive field work. You're out every day, mapping, drawing, coloring, building strat columns, measuring, you do the whole gamut, at least in geology. But I've heard recently that more and more schools are either switching to like semester or class-based field components. So those count towards your field camp. So you might go out in the field for a few days for a class, and that counts towards some of that. And I think that's still like a good component. But I've also heard that because of the expensive, like the expenses and things like that students have to pay out of pocket for these field camps generally, that a lot of programs are starting to sort of say, well, like, how important is the field component? I mean, we could probably, get away with getting someone into a grad program or hiring someone at an institution or agency where maybe they don't have that component. And I just see that, like, it's a very subtle shift, but you do, like, I've heard a lot of students talk about it. And yeah, it's kind of like a sad thing for me to see that go away, because so much of the geosciences is built around obviously being outdoors. And of course, as part of the inclusive leadership roles that we're taking on, we're trying to shift people's perspectives on like, well, geoscience isn't just about being outdoors, right? Like a lot of us spend 90% of our time behind a computer, or, the numerical modeling is as important as the field component. So I think part of that also is why maybe some of that is shifting, which isn't necessarily, it's not altogether bad, but I think that it's still, I think, good to have that field component. It's good to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, I think you need context, and context in science is everything. Because if I just sent you a few samples and a few photographs and a few measurements from what was going on in La Palma, you might pick one thing. But if you're actually down there on the ground, hearing the explosions night after night after night, the sound, smelling the gas, seeing the ash, seeing the people, I mean, you get a completely different perspective of what's going on. And I can send you, some samples from Tenerife. But again, unless you see those extraordinary landscapes around you, you don't know how to put that into a context. So I just don't think you can draw the right conclusions unless you've got some really good dirt under your fingernails,
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. The volcanoes that I read about in text and whatnot, they don't leave an imprint as much as the ones that I've gone to visit. So
right,
clear.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, there's a sad trend in the UK as well, where some universities are actually closing their geology departments because early on in education here, it's not taught in a way that people get engaged with it. And I find that extraordinary. because actually these subjects are tackling some of the big questions of our day. Volcanology is a really young subject with lots of major questions we still need to research and understand. We need cross-pollination from different subjects in order to get to these, because there's so many different things that need to be thought about. And we're not reaching those young people to infuse them about this in a way that they feel they want to engage and build a career around it. So I think we're doing the sector a bit of a disservice in our early years, certainly here in the UK, to build that groundswell of support and interest that the students then go forward. And of course, those that do end up coming through and are in it, they're just blown away, because it is a really interesting topic. And some of the biggest questions that we have in volcanology: when exactly is it going to start? Where exactly is it going to start? And when is it going to stop? We still don't have an answer to. Hey, that's pretty crucial.
Yeah, I mean, considering, like the science for it really took off right after the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption. So we're now almost 40 years on from that. So more than 40 years. So, I mean, it's surprising how far we've come along in the field, but just how much we just don't know at all.
Yeah. Well, that was really evident in La Palma, where in the weeks and months leading up to the eruption, they had some really strongly felt earthquakes. Mm-hmm. And the way they would measure it is by sending reports to Madrid on a scale. And the scale was something along the lines of, was it so strong that you felt it? Was it so strong that a pot fell off your shelf? Or was it so strong that, and they had this, and they would literally send these reports to Madrid. Whereas this time around, they had a local and a national institution with a wide network of deployed equipment to measure it. So, and that's just since, the 70s to now. So that's really very recent.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it feels like, especially in volcanology, at least for the time being, most of our scientific understanding of eruptions comes post-eruptive. Like it comes after the eruption happens, or at least during a huge amount of it, because like you said, we don't know when these things are going to erupt, and we can monitor and things like that. But most of our understanding about what happens during these eruptions really is post-end,
Oh, for sure. And for many years afterwards, and the same will be in La Palma. La Palma, it was in many ways a very accessible eruption next to a town. So hundreds of scientists have taken samples, measurements, are collaborating, are looking at, and that's all great. And over the next 10 years, we're probably going to see a huge sort of burst of different interpretations come out. But obviously during the event, there's a job to be done. And all of these institutions are so stretched to the limit that it's very difficult for them to keep up with any analysis or interpretation that would take us forward. They're just dealing with the emergency there and then. It's after the event that they have time to reflect and pull things together in collaboration with other scientists. So it's tricky, but a lot of science will come out of this, and some really exciting science, I think, as well. But we just want to make sure that we keep the focus on the people, because we think we need to do better to help the people.
Well, that's amazing. I'm grateful for the work that you guys are producing, and I'm sure the students are as well. I'm happy to hear that you're continuing a field component, because I do believe that immersive learning component is essential. Even someone from physics has said that that's really essential. So, I mean, we can
absolutely. We've had physics. Last year we had a physics scholar from India. So we take from lots of different disciplines, and what we try and do is have a really rounded program, because as I say, we're not a university. So we do the science communication, but then in terms of the science, we go from putting them in our proper open research projects where they're out in the field doing the research, but then they come back in with our experts and they do the analysis. And then we give them training into how to write an abstract, how to write a poster, and they then have to present them. And those posters are then presented at international conferences at EGU, here at VMSG in the UK, so they have an opportunity to present. So what we want our program to be is to have the science communication element, but in terms of the science training, give them a really rounded set of skills where they can sort of really bounce off in their future careers with a nice network of contacts that they've made out in the field with us in the Canary Islands.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love it. I wanted to ask you, in the last 10 years, this might be a very obvious question, but the demographics and the sort of the global demographics of your students, has that changed exponentially over the last 10 years? Was it mostly based in Europe, like students were coming, and now you see global students coming, or what has happened there?
Absolutely. So when we started, it was pretty UK centric because we had very humble beginnings, and we took a few students from the UK and we just built gradually. What was interesting is that then started expanding to global students. And then we had COVID, right? Mm-hmm. And we were one of the first to say, look, we've got to still run. So obviously in 2020, we couldn't run a program. There was a lockdown everywhere. But then after that, we decided we have to get students back out in the field again, even though universities certainly here were reticent to see how they could do that. So we put a whole protocol in place where students had to test before they arrived. They stayed at the field trip center in a bubble for 48 hours, tested for COVID again. And then we moved around in our bubbles. So there was no clubbing, no going out to bars or restaurants. But it meant that we could offer a field training program out in the field because we were determined to get them out into the field. And in that time, there was a restriction on what students could come because some countries still had travel restrictions on. But since travel has been getting back to normal, we're having a wide diversity. So we've had students from India, from all over Latin America, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Hong Kong and China, all over Europe, obviously, as well. And that's what makes it so rich and exciting, because these students then have these connections across the world when they then go back into work in their various fields, which is really nice.
Yeah. Nobody from the States?
Lots from the States and Canada. Okay. Oh, yeah. We've had scholars from the States, we've had students from the States, and they're amazing because actually you'll find that what they're learning at university often is quite different to what similar students are learning in other countries. Mm-hmm. And that's really rich as well. So even in their downtime, the thing about science students is that they still talk about science in their downtime. I mean, this is, as an outsider, I find this crazy, but it's true. And they're so keen on what they're studying, which is lovely. So there's that cross-pollination as well between them and what their particular interests are. Yeah.
That's awesome. I can't speak enough to the project and this whole field component that you're doing. I think it's fantastic. I think that having sort of that global perspective too, of knowing, where research is headed in each of the different countries around the world, and being able to, pull together and I mean, we often find that, sometimes governments in other countries are really protective about the data that they're collecting, for several reasons. But, not sharing that data comes at a cost, right? Because in a place like Indonesia, and I'm not saying that they're one of the countries that does this, but in Indonesia, I mean, they have very active volcanic systems. And I mean, their volcanoes are erupting left, right, and center. And that's such valuable information to the, global network, knowing, exactly what's happening in that country, and then being able to apply that to other volcanoes. And so I love that aspect of the program.
Yeah. And what's extraordinary, and I get a real sort of head of steam about this, is when you have institutions working with public money that don't publish their information openly. Yeah. Everything we do is open access, we're here to train students, not to sort of secrete information away so that one day we can do something with it, which will be spectacular, and we make all of this available to the community, to anybody who can find it interesting. So when we collaborate with international institutions, for example, we've got a project we're setting up with University of Florida this summer, which is going to be really exciting because they're testing kit and again, the premise was, whatever we end up doing with this, all the information is to be openly accessible. So everything we've done in La Palma, all the data sets that we've collected, all the stuff that we've written, all the analysis, everything is openly available for everybody.
That's great. I know one of my biggest pet peeves is not having open access journals. I think just, it really hits a nerve for me.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. No, paywalls are, an impediment to science. There's no other way of saying it.
Yeah, unfortunately. Hopefully that will change at some point. Obviously, it costs money to publish, and I get that. But since everything is so digital these days, it seems like the cost is very minimal to.
But I think you have to draw a distinction. So we hosted a journalist from National Geographic who was out with us in La Palma for a couple of weeks. You should have seen the work that went into the article that she wrote, not just from her, but actually from her graphics department, her editors, and she researched it for a long time before and spent a long time working on it after her time with us. And you can accept that National Geographic, you have to buy the magazine to read it because there's all of this that goes in. Where I have a problem is where you have a public institution with public money gathering data in a very, in a way that other people don't have that privileged access to, and then still publishing behind a paywall.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of things about science that have kind of become part of the landscape, which actually, when you take a step back, you think, well, what? And that's really one of them. But we know we need your generation to stand up and say, hey, this isn't right. My generation fought a lot of battles to put you where you are now. You've got to take that baton and push these forward so that we keep having these conversations and keep opening the doors and making sure we bring down barriers, because it's just not right. Absolutely.
Nothing like lighting a little fire under people to get them going.
Yes. Yes.
Well, this is amazing work, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about all the things that GeoTenerife is doing, and especially it would be great to hear from students and their experiences with GeoTenerife. Hopefully,
absolutely. Well, why don't you could set a time and you can link to them when they're in the field and hear what they're doing out in the field.
That'd be
absolutely
great. Yeah.
Yes.
So we're gonna shift a little bit, and we're going, it's not a big shift, but I'd like to get into volcano stories and sort of what the inspiration and the inspiration behind it was, and then what is the plan in terms of doing more collaborative work around volcano stories. So can you just explain to us what Volcano Stories is, first of all?
Yeah, so we were actually finishing up one of our summer training camps in Tenerife when La Palma erupted. And then when that happened, we decided, what can we contribute to what's going on? Because if you're going to go into this sort of area, it's not to go and just take pictures and selfies and go, woo, you have to think long and hard about what your contribution is. Mm-hmm. And our contribution, we felt at the time, was to give context to what was going on, and particularly in English, because there wasn't much coming out that was other than these sort of rather dramatic headlines and really close-up shots, and to give a voice to the local people as well, because we felt that a lot of the media that was there at the time wanted a dramatic story. They wanted to film a grandmother crying as she evacuated her house, or wanted that immediate quick shot and then zoom back. And there was a lot of media crews there, there was a lot of pressure on the locals. So the whole project started off really with my iPhone. And I said, look, I'm a journalist. I want to do a documentary about this, but I want people to be able to tell their stories in their own time. Because an event like this, everybody is impacted by. If you watch the documentary that we made, Lava Bombs, every single person who comes out on that screen hasn't had a good night's sleep in a very long time. You may disagree with some of the decisions they took, if they're politicians, or some of the ways that they presented their messages, or whatever it might be. But those people were under a huge amount of pressure, and we wanted to allow those people the space and time to tell us their story, and in a way that we could really hear them. The event was dramatic itself. We didn't need to sort of pressurize people into crying for us on screen. And our commitment was that even if we ended up cutting a 45-minute documentary, we would publish in their entirety every single interview that we did. Because what happens in these events, when you start collaborating with outside agencies, and this institution, in this case, we collaborated with New Light Studio, who is an amazing production company here in the UK with the most amazing heart behind the work that they do. And Alex Whittle was the director of that. He did such a good job, and he really elevated something that was just sort of iPhone footage and just took it to full feature status. He was fantastic. But I said to him right from the off, we have to make sure that every clip that we use is used in context. So you can't just take the one thing from here and put it over here with a dramatic volcano in the background to make it a different story. And that's really tough, because you have to be true to the story. And I said, I recognize that every interview that we're doing could probably be done in 5 minutes, but you can't get to the bottom of people's stories in 5 minutes and give them the time and the space they need to tell you those stories. And it was also important to have these long interviews that cover a whole range of topics, because that's history. We were witnessing history unfolding in front of our eyes. And so all of those documents now, they've become like documents of record in a way, because after an event, if you interview people a year after the event, they're not going to talk to you in the same way. They're not going to remember the same things that were difficult for them at that precise moment. And those are the things we have to keep in the consciousness of anybody planning for a future emergency, of any scientist researching what actually happened at the time, any emergency manager who's trying to think about how they would plan if there was an eruption in Tenerife, for example, which has a much higher density of population. So the risk of the hazard there is so much higher. So we had so much material. I came up with the idea of, on the website, of doing something called volcano stories. So some of our amazing students still collaborate with us and work for us going forwards, and they continue this research, so that we have compiled data sets, we have compiled all of the tweets at the time, and a way of recording them and rescuing them if they subsequently get deleted. We do updates, we have a timeline, we have all the interviews, drone footage and models, and all of this we wanted to be openly available. And on the back of this, we've opened up lots of collaborations, for example, with the University of Florida for research going forwards. But again, our interest isn't to own all of this in an archive somewhere. We want it to be useful, and we actively want scientists to be able to go in and research it, and students as well. So it's fantastic. Students at universities here in the UK are already using it as part of their coursework, which is exactly what I wanted. So I'm really pleased.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I love how you're talking about context, because me personally, sometimes I'll watch a documentary and I'll have a deep distrust of what they're telling me, just because it feels way too dramatic, and I'm not really sure if that's really happening, if they're really lining things up how it sequentially happened or whatnot. And yeah, and it's hard to check that stuff too as just an observer. You don't really know how they tied their story together.
Exactly. And I think we were in a very lucky position where we self-funded the documentary, so we didn't have pressure from anybody to have to pitch it or a certain way, or and as a journalist, I wanted to be 100% faithful to the truth as I felt it was told to me. And some people have said, but Sharon, you don't tell us what to think about certain things in your documentary. And I'll say, well, actually what I'm trying to show you is an event with lots of different impacts, and for you to think about that and digest it. So I've had scientists say to me, oh, you know what, when I first saw it, I was quite angry because I didn't agree with with some of the stuff that was in there, and I felt I'd done a good job. But actually, when I took a step back and thought about it, do you know what I realized? Everybody has a different perspective, and your reality is different to your reality and my reality. And I've got to bear that in mind when I'm messaging, and not just think that my reality is the only reality. And I was like, yes!
That's awesome. I know. I was going to say, leading off of Brian's comment, is that, oftentimes these documentaries or these shows have, whether intentional or unintentional, biases in them. And it's because it's just looking at those very narrow perspectives, but it's not really giving you the whole scope.
That's what sells.
Yeah.
Because that's what sells, So, I'm aware that the documentary you've made is basically a scientific paper on film in some respects, because we do try to look at things in depth and a range of things. And sure, we could cut the film in half and it could make it very exciting and up the music and, make those close-ups a little bit closer. But I didn't see the point in doing that after everything I'd seen and lived through, and the students had worked on, and people we'd spoken to, and being in people's home and being in people's offices and spending time with the scientists, the politicians, the emergency managers. That wasn't what needed to be said. And I said to them, you know, the story here isn't seeing somebody crying. The story is sitting down and listening to what's happening to you and trying to make sure things happen differently in a future event. That's what's important. But that's a harder story to sell.
For sure.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting that you kind of talked about was the time aspect of how soon you interview them after an event and how their memory of it slightly changes. And I'm just thinking about how you could do a whole study on that, on how like someone's perspective changes over each year after an event has happened, and what kind of influence just time has on
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely, because all of that will then have an impact on resilience. Because if that family suddenly starts talking about it in a different way, starts thinking about it in a different way, they'll start taking different decisions. You know, they might decide not to insure their house because it's too expensive, and they'll do something else instead.
Yeah.
Or you know, they might forget that actually, you know, the volcano went here and then I live. You know, there's lots of decisions, little decisions, important decisions that you take that suddenly, you know, get pushed to one side because other things become important. And I'm not saying that people in the Canary Islands should live with the fear 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nobody's saying that. But I think we have had a tendency to downplay the reality of volcanic eruptions because it had this sort of rather friendly, kind feel around it, fuzzy, warm feel. And I'm not saying people should be terrified, but they should be informed, you know, and they should be aware. You know, and that's really important. That's certainly something we're going to be pushing this summer.
Yeah,
I love that. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, hearing it from a different perspective is maybe not the most positive experience for people. But I think it's also important to highlight, like, yeah, there are real issues around, you know, volcanic eruptions and other earth processes where, you know, as scientists, yeah, we can go in and we're interested in collecting and we're interested in gathering that data. But for us, it's about, you know, using that data to understand future processes, whereas those are the people living in the moment, living that experience, having to live that over and over again sometimes because, you know, some volcanoes are just very active. And really how tough it is for those communities to deal with those processes.
Yeah, and I think we also just wanted to help to build empathy. So you had a lot of people coming and going, whoo, clink a glass of champagne, selfie, Instagram, right in front of people with their binoculars, trying to see if their house had been devoured. You're now getting the odd scientist going and standing on top of the lava flow going, oh, here we are in La Palma, literally standing on top of the place where somebody lost their house. Yeah. That's not cool. That's not cool. You know, we've got to really, so that's why for me, the human stories were really important, but not just of the people. You have the head of the Guardia Civil saying, you know, when this first happened, the first thing we did was all run away, you know, and it was harder for my my security guards who were based in La Palma because they had to evacuate the baker who served us bread or who put the coffee on the table. So they knew these people. And you're suddenly thinking about all of these people. They're not just a police force. Suddenly you're thinking of them as individuals and the effect and the impact on them as people. And I think that's really healthy and something we need to do in all of these situations.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it on the head there, Sharon, for sure. And I am actually, in fact, just now looking at the website, the Volcano Stories website, which I hope you don't mind I'll share with our
sure.
It's a fantastic website. They have a lot of YouTube videos, they have the interviews, but they also have just a whole host of things on this website. They have 3D drone models. You can go in and interactively play with drone models, which is, if you've never done that before, like DEMs and stuff like that, it's really cool. They have interviews, they have timelines that you can go look at. Yeah, I think this is just, they have a trailer for the lava bombs video. So if you want to check that out, you should. Yeah, it's a fantastic website, and I'm just impressed and blown away by all the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all the amazing students that we work with. It's their work, really. You know, they've done an amazing job, and we're really grateful to them.
That's brilliant. And speaking of which, I want to now jump into the production of Lava Bomb. So what was it like making that film? I mean, you got like real hands-on, like real-time experience with a lava eruption and filming a documentary. So Yeah, I'm interested in hearing what
It was completely, it was completely surreal, because as soon as we arrived in La Palma, we had 3 of our students with us who did and our resident volcanologist, Alexis Schwartz, and they were doing interviews with CNN, with the BBC, and it was insane. And the whole idea was just to give this really good context in English to what was going on. But I realized, all the wrong questions were being asked, and we weren't really thinking about the bigger picture. And as I say, I am a journalist by nature, and I had my iPhone. That's all I had. But iPhones nowadays are extraordinary. You can literally just put an iPhone up and ask people a question and get 4K footage out of that. It's just, when you think about it, it's extraordinary. So it's thanks to this technology and the accessibility of this eruption that we were able to get all of these interviews. And what was extraordinary was when you take time to speak to people, to say to them what you're doing and why you're doing it, people really want to help you with that, because they can see how important that is, and they want people to know their stories, and they want to avoid the similar things happening in the future. But it was exhausting. It was exhausting. Our days would end up at 4 o'clock in the morning, taking interviews at the edge of an exclusion zone with whoever who was, in the middle of doing something. But it was also really exciting because, you felt like you were really getting under the skin of such a wide breadth of stories. And that's what I wanted more than anything. I wanted to really give a snapshot, not just of the 2 or 3 people who were on TV, but the guy who was, the other side of the island serving a coffee. How did that affect him? The guy in the capital who was sweeping ash. What did he think about it? And what was the person on the other side? What were they doing in their day-to-day, and how did that impact them? So we've got so much material. We've actually only just put a portion on it on the website for now, because we have to process it all and package it all up and publish it. But we'll keep doing that. That is our commitment, because I think it'll make a useful resource going forwards. And these voices want to be heard. We spoke to women who've lived 3 volcanic eruptions, and they have extraordinary stories to tell about the eruption in 1949. One woman who told me, my baby sister was in a cot. So my mum used to put a muslin cloth over the top and shake off the ash in the morning when we woke up, and all of these testimonies would have been lost otherwise. So we just really wanted to make sure they were captured, and we took a snapshot of it all so that it was preserved.
And it's such raw material too. Like, I'm sure a lot of it was not scripted. You weren't like, hey, we're going to ask you these questions, A, B, C. Like, you just asked and they told. And that's fantastic. That's awesome.
Well, you don't know what the documentary is going to be. Normally, when you make a documentary, you have a script, you have some questions, and you go in and you shoot to your script. So the documentary director, Alex, it was a bit of mind-bending for him, because I said to him, we don't know what we're going to get, but we know it's important and we want to tell this story. Mm-hmm. So literally we were going in and interviewing all the people we felt were key for this story to be told. And then we sat down with the students, and they were amazing. We had 2 amazing students work with us, Ben Island and Rosie Rice. They were our science consultants, and they sat with us to put everything together, and we identified the themes that we wanted to pick up. Obviously, there's a lot more we could have spoken about, but you have to pick your key themes. And then identify who were going to be the voices to bring these themes to the fore. But again, that's why we wanted to publish everything in its entirety, because there's a lot more in there that needs to be spoken about. But yeah, it doesn't all fit in a 1-hour documentary, for sure. But it's exhausting. I have incredible admiration for these people who lived for 85 days of an eruption, with the ash, a constant thing. I mean, ash, it looks like sand, but it's actually little fine bits of glass, and if they get in your eye and you rub your eye, it's really uncomfortable. Explosions all through the night, new vents opening up. So the town where we stayed was literally just 3 or 4 kilometers away. And when all of these earthquakes are going on, you're kind of thinking, is another one going to open up nearer here? There's a lot of uncertainty. These people lived with it. We would go in for a week, 10 days at a time, and then we'd have to leave and recover and rest and sort of, gather our thoughts and then go back. I have the utmost admiration for people who were there throughout. I don't know how they carried on with their day-to-day lives, raising their children, going to their jobs with all of this going on next to them. It's an extraordinary event.
How did you find the individuals that you interviewed?
That's an excellent question as well. So in terms of the people in power, they were obvious, the president of the Cabildo or Canary Islands.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the residents, we spoke to so many people, but some of them just came across as they just spoke so well and so engagingly, and not in a way that, I didn't want people who just go, this is terrible, that, because the news was doing. These were people who we got to know over a long period of time, who we interviewed many times, and we've subsequently interviewed on the 1-year anniversary. We're subsequently going back to interview now for Lava Bombs 2. And they were just people we felt would be really strong, representatives of what a lot of people were going through. So Samuel was obviously local, and he works with us as a drone pilot. Andrea was representative of a lot of German residents who used to have, or still do have, properties on the island. So she was representative of a very important segment there as well. And then other residents as well. And what we started off was this campaign called Samuel La Palma, where Samuel would publish his photographs and people would donate money towards our Samuel La Palma campaign. And we collaborated with a local store that sold electronic goods, because what we realized people really needed were just basic things like a microwave or a washing machine or a fridge, because they weren't given emergency housing straight away. Some people were sharing 12 people in a 2-bedroom flat owned by a brother. There was an 80-year-old man living in a garage, and all he asked us for was a 30-quid microwave so he could heat up some food. I mean, really, and we felt that was a way we could help giving business to this local electrical shop, and he'd lost some of his property, so that was giving him his business, but he knew exactly who all the local people were who'd been affected, because he had all of their addresses in his database. So we knew it was going directly to families who had lost stuff, not to be too brutal about it. And it was just direct help. So any money that came in went out in goods to families who needed whatever it was they needed, cooker, washing machine, whatever it was that would help them in that moment. Because we felt that was something that we could do, and we had lots of people following what we were doing, and they wanted to be able to help. And a lot of money was raised during the event, but there's still a lot of unclarity about where some of that money went. So we wanted ours to be really direct to families. So some of the people you hear from are people that we helped through our Samuel La Palma campaign, who we subsequently interviewed and had really interesting stories to tell.
That's really awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, you've pretty much already talked about this, but building that, I commend all of you, just because it takes such a large amount of time to build that rapport with locals, to get them to open up to you, to be able to share their stories in a way which they don't feel threatened by anything, or they don't feel like what they say is going to be negative in any impact. I think that's just amazing to me that you were able to just interview so many individuals and get them to just tell their story. It's really,
yeah, and I think it's a huge responsibility as well, right? Because you have their story in your hands, and you have to be really careful what you do with that, and be really respectful what you do with that. And I think a lot of it was down to the fact that they knew who we are and what we've been doing in La Palma for the last 10 years. It also helps that I'm bilingual in Spanish. So obviously, if they wanted to be interviewed in Spanish, that was fine. And that makes a huge difference, because if people spoke English, they might be more comfortable being interviewed in Spanish. And it takes time to build those relationships and for people to feel happy and confident to do that. But we didn't put pressure on anybody. I mean, we spoke to lots of other people who didn't want to be interviewed, and hey, that's fine too. That the point wasn't to stress anybody out. It was to try and get something positive out of all the negative that we saw around us. And we saw a lot of really heartbreaking things, some of them that aren't in the movie, but there were some really tough moments, and there still are really tough moments for some people in La Palma.
Yeah, I can imagine. I feel like as scientists, sometimes we're removed from a lot of those things, which is sad. It's really disappointing, actually, because in the end, you're learning about these processes because you want to better be able to mitigate the risks and the hazards to the communities that live around volcanoes. So yeah, I can't say enough about your group. I think like if everyone just goes to your website, like I'd be happy. So everyone, all of our listeners, just go to the GeoTenerife website. You won't be disappointed.
That's very kind. And I think what I would say to anybody studying volcanology is you can't become frozen in the headlights of thinking all the time of the impact on the people, because what we need you guys to do is to do your job well, you know, and to study the science and put the messages out, but just to develop that empathy and not just think about volcanoes as something exciting, which it is. And everybody on the island who've been affected still says, you know, there's two sides to it. It's destructive, but we recognize that's an emotional, natural phenomenon that we can't take our eyes off, you know. And whenever I arrived in La Palma, the first thing I'd do is drive to the volcano lookout point and just stare at it, and it'd be the last thing I'd look at before I left, you know. And it had this sort of personality. So on the one hand, you're heartbroken for the people, but there is this draw of a natural process. So to any students in this field, I'd say just be aware, but don't let it stop you doing what you're doing. We need you to do what you're doing, but just do it with a little bit of empathy in your heart. You can't go far wrong.
Well said.
Yeah, love that. So there's some hints that you're filming a part 2 of Lava Bombs as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think very early on, we were interviewed by the BBC, and I said, the thing about this eruption is that we've got every single international news crew you can think of here in the first 10 days, and then everybody's going to go home and forget about it. We will be here and we will continue researching, we'll continue interviewing, we'll continue shining a light on this, because things will arise that need attention. So we're hoping that in September 23, so September this year, we'll release part 2, which is going to be on the reconstruction, because, you know, some people feel that the reconstruction has been handled so poorly that actually the effects on them is almost worse than the volcanic eruption. So clearly that's something we need to talk about. But we also want to talk about the rebirth. You know, we're talking about a small part of La Palma which has been directly affected by the volcano. The rest of it is just the most gorgeous place that we hold very close in our hearts. And we want to be part of that effort for people to get to know the other stunning things about La Palma. But we also are thinking of maybe having an element of talking about volcanic preparedness for the future as well, just so that we have those conversations.
That's amazing. Have you, just kind of a random question, but have you noticed any change in tourism since that eruption? Has it increased? Has it decreased?
That's a really interesting question. So we spoke to, for example, a local tour provider in Tenerife during the eruption, and he was filling 3 buses every single day, 7 days a week during the eruption, taking tourists across to La Palma. So they would go, have lunch, take their photographs and come home. I think now that same operator I spoke to 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I think he's probably sending 2 or 3 buses a week. So there's a huge investment in promotion of La Palma as a destination now, because if you know, the volcano had an economic impact on them, a drop in tourism numbers could have an even greater impact. But the problem that you have is obviously that a lot of the accommodation, the premier site for the tourist, Puerto Naos, is still closed off because of gas. So there's less available in terms of accommodation. But I have to say, what we always do is go Airbnb. We're not sponsored by Airbnb, but we try to look for locals who are renting their property, because we feel that's the way of directly helping a local person and generating some income from there, rather than being with these sort of big hotels who take their profits outside the island.
That's true. And I was wondering that, because I was wondering how much of that could actually go towards like recovery and reconstruction efforts on the country. But yeah, it's interesting. Definitely Airbnb, or, you know, rent.
There's a lot to be said for Airbnb.
Yeah, great. Well, Sharon, this has been an amazing conversation. I think I at least could talk to you all day long.
It's been so good to meet you both.
Yeah, I want to leave a little bit of intrigue for our listeners and make them go to your website and look at all the awesome information. I want to talk a little bit, because we were talking before we started recording. So you said you have 3 main objectives for for your work that you're doing. So one is sustainable tourism on the islands, volcano preparedness, which is so important. But the third is kind of in a different direction, which is all about academic bullying. And I just want to briefly touch upon this because I think for our listeners and for so many of the students that we have, in our program and outside of BSU, I think this is an important thing to focus on.
It's a huge topic. Look, we're a bit of a strange company. We think of ourselves more as a family, which means when we come across something we believe in, we spend time on it. There's no other reason than that. And what we've noticed over the last 10 years, I've heard some truly heartbreaking stories about some of the situations some of our young students and early career researchers find themselves in at university or institutions. I have to say, not the majority, which is good, but we get students from all over the world, and some of them tell some really heartbreaking stories. And it just made us so sad to think that they're in this situation and there doesn't seem to be an apparent way of offering 2 or 3 words of advice that would just fix it, right? So we decided we need to research how widespread this program is in the first instance. We need to help put something out there to show that certain behaviors that have become normalized in science are not appropriate and are actually bullying. We have to debunk this whole thing. Just because in the 80s they used to go out in the fields from sun up to sundown and work 7 days a week, that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. And I get it. I was a journalist in the 80s, right? I worked in some really tough environments. I had to really stand up for myself, but that doesn't mean it was right. And that doesn't mean I should subject somebody else to it. And that doesn't mean we haven't evolved as a society. Imagine if we were still doing other things like we did in the 1980s. I mean, it'd be pretty rubbish. I can tell you, I was there. Mm-hmm. Other things were great about the 80s, but not this particular thing. So we've actually been talking to 2 incredible people. One is Catalina Arguello, who we work with at University of La Rioja, who's a beautiful, incredible person, but she's also a social scientist who's going to take care of some of the research with us with Ben Ireland, but also the academic parity movement in the States, because they researched a really interesting paper on this topic, but mainly based on North America. So what I wanted to do was widen the scope to see what we can see globally, because what I want to get a handle on is, are these just random stories that I'm hearing? Because my feeling is they've got worse after COVID and more prevalent. So we want to know how prevalent it is, how ingrained it is, start to have some sort of attention given to what is and isn't acceptable in these cases, and try to start thinking about what we can do to support and where we can point people, what things they can think about, all of these things, and just make sure that young scientists who are in this situation realize, A, they're not alone, and B, it is not acceptable. Somehow we've become to think that it's normal that if we have a really powerful scientist publishing lots of papers who is defended by their institution, can act whichever way they want to, because the whole of science is built in such a way that actually they have to be competitive, they have to be aggressive, and they wield a lot of power if they publish a lot and they get a lot of grants. But we can't forget that there's a lot of people involved here, and they deserve to be heard, they deserve to be respected, they deserve to be supported, and one of the people I spoke to said they believe the whole future of science is at risk because of this subject, because actually we're losing people from science who are amazing, and why should they just be these huge, hard-nosed self-promoters just to get their intellect out there and at use for society? So yeah, it's something we believe in very deeply. It's a really tricky subject to navigate. People get very touchy about it. But I think, again, as a small independent company who works with all of these stakeholders, we have no interest in one or another. We're hopefully in a good position to have an independent look at it and support the work of the academic parity movement and move this forwards, because it's just not right what's happening, and it's affecting people's mental health, and it means really talented people are leaving science, and that's just not right.
Yeah, I appreciate that you guys are tackling such a huge issue within the academia world. Is there anything that you could suggest that Brian and I could do locally here to help facilitate, better academic environments, or can we suggest or guide students to a particular institution, which they can then share their stories?
Yeah, so in April or May, we're going to be launching our survey. So I'll send you a link to that. It's really important that we hear stories, that we hear testimony from anybody. Well, even if they haven't had anything of this kind happen, we want to hear that testimony too, because we want to be able to gauge how prevalent it is. So if we get the majority of surveys back saying, do you know what, everything's great, I feel supported, I'm happy, I'm progressing, great, that's a really good news story to be able to tell. Secondly, we're going to produce a short animation to show what the problem is, because we need people to be able to identify and recognize what isn't acceptable. So we would appreciate help with dissemination of that. And then once we have all the information in, we will then talk about, next steps. But in the interim, if anybody is suffering, A, know you're not alone. B, know that it's not acceptable. And C, look at the academic parity movement online. They have some really good resources as a starter for 10, and that's what we're going to be building on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will definitely share out that information with our students and with listeners of the podcast if they're interested in that sort of work. Sharon, this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so grateful for all the things that you're doing, your knowledge, your journalistic background, which has led you to the point. You are doing, the saints' work. So thank you.
Well, a pleasure, Ashley. Lovely to meet you briefly in New Zealand, and so nice to get a chance to sort of sit and chat to you a bit longer. And Brian, lovely to meet you. Love what you guys do, and very happy to support you with anything that you need as well.
Thank you. Yeah. And for all of our listeners, be sure to check out the GeoTenerife website. Even if you're not a volcanologist, it's a really fascinating source of information. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you at our next episode.
Well, that was an epic conversation.
We'd like to thank all of our listeners.
Tune in next time for another EpicEarth podcast.
I'm exhausted. Oh my God.
That was a long one.
That was a long one. Oh my God.